Awani, berita segenap dimensi.
I still have Sarah Chynoweth on the show, and we're talking about sexual reproductive health and also humanitarian disasters and crisis areas, and how we should put this also at the front, apart from just putting food and shelter into the pipeline of humanitarian assistance. But if we were to discuss this, the difficulty is in getting the empathy. I mean, you have to discuss this in New York, in maybe even The Hague, Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, or Bangkok maybe, where it's quite far detached from the areas where you want this kind of attention to be diverted to. For example, Darfur, and or maybe even Haiti. And how do you put forth empathy as an effect and outcome of any discussion on this? Because it's so easy for people to see, well, this is another women conference focusing on women issues, but you can't help solve this crisis if you don't have men also taking part in this.
Yes, I absolutely agree. It is essential to involve men in women's issues. That we can't do it without them. Yes. And that's not just because men are often the decision makers in families, but also all men are not perpetrators. They want to care for their families. They want to see their wives and their daughters healthy and secure. And sometimes they are turned off by a sort of women's agenda. But I do think that reaching out to men and engaging with them, and that is happening more and more.
Okay, if I turn that around, let's put a bit more excitement into it, make it a bit more controversial. If I put that as a policy, for example, if it was America discussing their policy on Iraq, I don't see this being at the forefront, because they'll be talking about deployment of army and about safe areas, green zones. But if even you talk about green zones, it might be green zone apart from armed conflict. But sexual assaults and rape and violence doesn't need to have armed conflicts around it. For example, the absence of gun doesn't mean it's the absence of violence against women. So how do you put this also as a political agenda? Because if you keep discussing it as civil society's agenda, but it might work on that end in terms of humanitarian assistance and all that, but in terms of policies being executed in crisis areas, for example, it needs to be number one too.
Absolutely. I mean, you've hit on one of the big issues, is that we can't just engage one sector without addressing the other. And engaging the political arena, especially around policies, is really key to advancing this agenda. Yeah, for example, in the United States, it is difficult. A lot of times people look to the West and see it as more egalitarian in terms of gender, and in some ways it is, but we have a long way to go to advance this issue. And you need policies in place. You can train, you can advocate, you can build up civil society, but if you don't have national policies, if you don't have the government support, it doesn't hold as much weight.
Sometimes when I drive, I get riled up when I see people throwing things out from the car window. But they get away with it, so they will do it again. And when I was following the podcast discussion you had with two other very esteemed spokesperson on this issue, and it's about making people who had committed this crime and atrocity being held accountable to it. I mean, we cannot do anything. I wish that we can reverse time and stop what happened in Bosnia and Darfur. But we know and being acknowledged in the tribunals and testimonies that there was systematic rape and assault on women. And but the thought that that happened is one thing. But post the crisis, and yet so little, maybe, the perception is being done to the culprits that did that. So maybe we cannot do anything but what happened. But we can make people who did these bad things be held accountable, and that must be pushed first and foremost on the international agenda.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. There is a climate of impunity around sexual violence, especially around crisis and conflict. So people do get away with it, and they know they can. And so that's part of the reason why they do that. So we need to address this issue. We need to sensitize peacekeepers. We need to sensitize all humanitarian actors that this is happening, and you can't just turn a blind eye. And it's also important to realize that this isn't just an African or Middle Eastern issue. It's happening in our region as well. In East Timor, for example, during their conflict, there was a lot of rape of women. In eastern Myanmar, again, in the conflict-affected settings, systematic rape of women. So we have to remember that this is an issue that's in our region as well, and we need to push policymakers, we need to push donors, we need to push the government.
So it's a political problem which help exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. And for example, if they don't talk about it, the women that have been the victims then would have to deal with this alone, and society might even ostracize. Good from the example that you've shared with us in Darfur, but that might not be the majority of cases in terms of people's response to what happened. So in your view, maybe this is the last point that we're going to make. How do we change this, and change this now? Not 5 years from now, not 1 year from now, but make a difference now.
How do we make the difference now? Yeah, this is the key question, because the example from Darfur is not the norm.
Because first the stigma must change.
The stigma must change. And a lot of times people put it on women. Oh, why aren't you coming forward to speak out? They're not the issue. The issue is the broader society. People's attitudes towards rape need to change. People still have really strange ideas that what a woman is wearing, why were you walking there, that they somehow invited the rape to happen. There's so much shame around it. And there is a lot of ostracization as a result. Sometimes husbands leave their wives. Sometimes they're rejected by their community. And apart from that, again, the very deep shame. So you can't just point the finger at women and say, you need to start speaking out. You really need to look at the broader society and make it a safe place for a woman to speak out, where she receives support and the care that she deserves.
So you'll be presenting a paper at the conference?
I will be, yes.
Okay. So we'll keep a lookout for that. And thanks to you for watching. Thanks to you for coming to the studio.
Thank you so much.
We'll carry on this topic in future discussions. Terima kasih banyak. Hantarkan pandangan anda seperti sudut pandang astro.com.my ataupun Facebook dan Twitter Awani ataupun Facebook dan Twitter saya sendiri. Dan sehingga berjumpa lagi, kita akan berbincang malam esok tentang Indonesia dan kebebasan media di sana, kerana ada seorang wartawan dan juga pengacara hebat yang akan muncul bersama saya di sudut pandang malam esok. Sekian, selamat malam dan terima kasih. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.